Let me start with a question. How many of you think that as good Christians, we should relate pretty much the same to Christians as to non-Christians? That we should love everyone equally and in the same way? How many of you think that? Now, there's no question that we should love every person. But you could say, I asked you a trick question. I said equally and in the same way. The answer is no. In fact, the Bible says that we have to relate somewhat differently to those who are not Christians than to those who are. We can see this stated simply by St. Paul. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all men, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Paul says we are to do good to everyone. You order something at McDonald's, be courteous to the service personnel. A beggar asks for loose change, give what you can, if that's how you'd like to help the poor person. But Paul states quite clearly that we express love especially to those who are of the household of faith. That is, our fellow Christians. This is similar to the obligation we have to our own family members. Because they are closest to us, we have more responsibility for them. We are committed to them. We therefore take a special concern to help our brothers and sisters in the Lord. But we should want to do good to all people. What's the best way of loving others? It's to help them toward eternal salvation. And what's a good way of making this happen? By disposing them favorably to our Christian beliefs and lifestyle. Paul says to the Colossians, conduct yourselves wisely toward outsiders, making the most of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone. What's another way of saying this? Look for ways to move people closer to the Lord. And as you find a chance, make good use of it. Anton Colella is a leader of our Sword of the Spirit community in Glasgow, Scotland. Anton can tell you story after story of talking to strangers and new acquaintances, say to the person seated next to him in an airplane, naturally bringing the conversation to the topic of, say, God's love or faith in Jesus Christ. Let's listen to Anton share one example. But there's another way of helping people to come to know the Lord, and that's by cultivating friendship with them. A relationship of genuine love, which over time disposes that person to want to know more about God. Here is Anton again. So far, I've given examples about relating with people who aren't Christians or who aren't Christian in any committed way. But this applies also to those who are Christian only by name, nominal Christians. In my country, many would say they're Christian, but they don't really practice their faith. And so our approach would be to try to bring them closer to the Lord too. What about those who truly are Christian but aren't part of our community or its outreaches? One thing you've probably noticed is that in our community and even in our outreaches, our teachings are drawn from the Bible and from Christian teachers through the centuries. And yet, many Christians have not heard or received such teaching, at least not in the form that you receive it through these presentations. They also don't have a community way of life based on a covenant to put it into practice. We therefore also need to relate somewhat differently to them than we would fellow members of our community. Now, let's recall the various talks you've heard in this series and ask how the principles you heard might apply to your relationships with those outside our community. One talk was about honor and respect and the importance of showing the value we place on others and on their positions. Another talk focused on speech that builds up. Our words can either build relationships or destroy them. They can strengthen people or hurt them. The next talk looked at how to handle conflicts and relationship difficulties, something that's quite normal even in the most loving of human relationships. I also spoke on being encouragers of one another and how fraternal and pastoral correction can be good for us. All these can be very useful in relating to those outside, but we have to apply them with some care. Many people today, depending on their cultural or personal background, might be uncomfortable when you express to them honor and respect. They might even get downright suspicious, thinking that you have an ulterior motive for doing that. They might not like it when you stand when they come in, or when you give them your seat out of courtesy, or open the door for them. Although in my experience, if it were done simply and discreetly, they often wouldn't mind. You see, many people, such as women, wouldn't like you to make a fuss over them. Some people today prefer casualness and informality. They see practices of honor and respect as too formal or ceremonial. Some people also take offense at being treated as if they were helpless or weak, unable to carry their own things or open the door themselves, when all we want is to show courtesy and value to them. And so, a little care or prudence is necessary. In general, though, I think people like to be treated well. The examples I've given, the little acts of everyday kindness and courtesy and showing honor, I think people in general very much like that. Being greeted warmly and cheerfully, experiencing our attentiveness when they speak. With wisdom on our part, we can express honor and respect appropriately to people who aren't part of our community. Something similar is true in the area of speech. People like it when we speak graciously to them and when we are encouraging. They are very happy about our not speaking against them or gossiping about them. On the other hand, this area can be more challenging to us because people may want to draw us into the way they themselves relate. They don't mind slandering or gossiping about others to us. They make disparaging jokes about others and they expect us to laugh. Jokes of a sexual nature, what's called toilet humor, or just bad and dishonoring jokes in general, these are very common. And if we don't join in the fun, we risk being called a killjoy or holier than thou. And so we need to be careful. We want to be, as Jesus says, wise as serpents and innocent as doves in our dealings with people whose speech patterns can often be unrighteous. Our way of relating with one another and the way we'd like to relate with others can be very countercultural. Perhaps the biggest place where we find resistance is in dealing with sin and wrongdoing. Most people don't like to be told that they are doing something wrong. Most people don't like to be corrected. If we try to correct them, we will often meet with defensiveness, even indignation. Who are you to tell me what's right or wrong? Or they might not say anything, no apology or admission of having done wrong, and inside they're boiling with anger. That's because many people today don't see as wrong the things we know to be wrong, such as in the area of sexual sin or in financial practices. Nor will most people ask for forgiveness. They're even uncomfortable when we ask their forgiveness for something we've done wrong towards them. Later in this presentation, I'll talk about handling conflicts with people outside the community. But at least it should be pretty clear by now that many people don't want or don't know how to handle questions of right and wrong in a direct Christian manner. Maybe you've noticed this too. Many people who aren't part of our community not only don't like to be corrected, they also don't like being encouraged to do better in how they live. Again, they think we're being judgmental or intolerant. They feel we should just mind our own business. And maybe we should. Later, I will give you principles or rules of thumb as to when to intervene and when not to. We also have to be somewhat careful about expressing affection. It's very natural among us when we greet one another as brothers and sisters. Heartfelt words of love, physical contact, and other gestures of endearment, these are so common to us that we can take them for granted. But be very careful outside. Your expressions of affection can be easily misinterpreted. You could be liable for the accusation of sexual harassment, or your actions could be misconstrued as flirting, or at the very least as flattery. Now, I'm not saying don't be affectionate or kind or warm or loving. No. People do appreciate kindness and even expressions of affection. Just be mindful, discreet, and careful. Now, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, and so on. These are in general admired and they are well received. And so, the more you show Christ-like character to your co-workers, extended family members, and other people with whom you have an ongoing significant relationship, the better you will be able to express Christ-like love and affection. To summarize, what you've learned in this series is usually helpful in relating to people who aren't part of us, but we need to adapt it to the situation we are in. This next part of my presentation is very important and will be somewhat longer. It's about dealing with relationship difficulties outside. You probably know by now that relationship difficulties are part of life. They're normal. If you say you haven't really experienced them, I say to you, just wait. Now, there are some kinds of relationship difficulties that are more common or that occur more frequently outside of community. Let me give you 3 reasons why this is so. First, people who haven't handed over their lives to Christ, who don't live by the power of the Holy Spirit, and who aren't part of a covenant community in which we are accountable to one another for living a righteous life, these people can be ruled by their unredeemed human nature. They end up being domineering, manipulative, driven by their impulse, prone to anger and for unforgiveness, etc. And such were we, St. Paul reminded Titus. For we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions and pleasures, passing our days in malice and envy, hated by men and hating one another. But when the goodness and loving kindness of God our Father appeared, He saved us. Second, outside of community, we might often have to deal with attempts to draw us into bad behavior. Unethical business practices, social intrigues or political factions at work, immoral sexual activity, bad speech, etc. And third, we also often face hostility to our Christian beliefs and lifestyle. People dislike us for trying to obey the 10 Commandments. They are angry at our stance against abortion, for example, or against sexual promiscuity or homosexual activity. There are no guaranteed prescriptions for how to handle conflict situations. We usually have to work our way through them. There are, however, a number of Christian principles that help. I'll give 4. The first principle is that we should seek peace. We should be men and women who seek to establish good relationships as much as we can and to avoid quarreling. Paul says to the Christians in Rome, if possible, so far as it depends upon you, live peacefully with all people. To Titus, his co-worker, Paul says, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for any honest work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all men. Here's one more passage. But we exhort you, brothers and sisters, to aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands, so that you may command the respect of outsiders and be dependent on nobody. If you put these three passages together, you see that Paul's general advice about how to relate outside the community is to avoid getting into conflicts as much as we can, to be cooperative where we can, and to handle our own lives well. When I say avoid getting into conflicts as much as we can, I don't mean that we should never disagree with anybody, we should always be a nice person and just put up with everything. No, we should be reluctant to get into fights, unless to do so means compromising our integrity. In general, we should be more cautious in our relationships outside and be less direct about bad things. I'd even say, let's maintain a non-judgmental spirit towards other people. Now, let me make myself clear. By non-judgmental, I don't mean that we ourselves become fuzzy about what's right and what's wrong. I don't mean we now accept other people's moral standards and think, maybe under-the-table business deals are fine. Or, I now accept premarital sex as normal and even a good thing. No. What I mean is, we can be more tolerant of people outside when they do wrong things than we are of good Christians. And the reason is, we can't, in fact, necessarily expect non-Christians or even nominal Christians to do better than they are doing until they get to know the Lord and receive His power to change. If we live among them, we need to put up with the way they live. In order to carry this off well, we need to be clear what limits we can go to in difficult situations. We need to know what's right and wrong, and at what point we simply have to say no. For the rest, we can practice forbearance and give way. How clearly can you state our Christian stance on moral matters, whether in business or in life issues such as euthanasia or abortion, or gender issues, or sexual matters? How should a Christian think of assisted suicide? How should a Catholic think regarding artificial contraception or divorce and remarriage? It's pretty obvious that many of us need more Christian teaching in order to know what's right and wrong, especially in new situations that crop up. We also need the counsel of our brothers and sisters. Once again, we see the great benefit of having pastoral care and support. Am I endorsing total pacifism? No. To say that we will seek to avoid conflict and be willing to put up with a lot that's not ideal doesn't mean we cannot or should not work for change in situations of conflict that we find ourselves in. Jesus says we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. That's what we are, and we want to obey Jesus in this. But we need wisdom to discern our best course of action. And then, when things reach an intolerable degree, there's the possibility of separation. We can choose to distance ourselves. Possibly this means changing our job or moving out of a bad living situation. It's not wrong or unchristian to finally decide that a particular situation is beyond repair or even hope, and to decide to go elsewhere. Of course, our family and sometimes our friends are a different matter. We have a commitment to our family, same with our friends. If, however, staying together means we cannot follow the Lord very well, or if it increases conflict, some separation might be necessary. Separation doesn't mean lack of love, and it can be only temporary. With our family, we should rarely make a complete break because of our family obligations. We can, however, put some distance between us and them, either temporarily or more long-term. With certain friends, sometimes we should simply stop relating to them, especially if they persist in openly living immoral lives or are hostile to our Christian faith. Speaking of hostility to our Christian faith, here we need a special strategy. My first advice is, insofar as it is still bearable, be meek. Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." The opposite of meekness is aggression. And so I'm simply saying, don't start a war. On the other hand, we should be firm, and we should take every opportunity to correct false things that are said regarding our Christian beliefs and practices. Many years ago, I read a book entitled Strength Under Control, written by a very good brother in the Lord, John Keating. John gave a very helpful rule of thumb as to when to be meek and when to have zeal to stand up for something. John said, if it's a matter of your rights, your reputation, your honor, your good name, etc., you can afford to be meek. But if it's a matter of God's honor, God's name, God's glory, no, you need to be zealous. In our normal day-to-day relating with people, we don't have to be moral crusaders. We're not the morality police. Jesus didn't commission us to clean up the world. Our main strategy can be neatly summed up in Romans chapter 12, verse 21. St. Paul says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Let me end with these well-known and potentially world-transforming words of Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its saltness, how shall its saltness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trodden underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid, nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven.